Listen, little black girl. Harvard isn't a daycare, and charity cases don't belong in my lecture hall. Take your mop and crawl back to whatever Roxbury project you came from.
That is what Professor Nathaniel Ashford said into a live microphone at Harvard, aiming his laser pen at the chest of a 13-year-old black girl in a school uniform, while 300 of America's wealthiest white students laughed out loud. The red dot sat on her blazer like a target. Her grandmother, 2 rows behind, lowered her eyes the way black women have been taught to lower their eyes for 400 years. The child didn't cry. She opened the notebook she'd carried for 11 months and quietly marked the page where she had already found the error in his famous theory. Have you ever watched a white man humiliate a black child and realized he just picked the wrong little girl? To understand how a 13-year-old black girl ended up in that lecture hall, you have to understand the building she walked into. Harvard's Lidauer Center sits on the north end of the campus, wrapped in white marble and old money. The walls are lined with portraits of men who have been dead for 2 centuries, and the hush inside the building is the kind of hush that believes in itself. This is where America trains the people who will one day run its economy. This is where the Federal Reserve sends its rising stars. This is where a textbook gets written, and then gets taught, and then becomes the only version of the truth anyone is allowed to question. Professor Nathaniel Ashford wrote that textbook. He was 58 years old, a John Bates Clark medalist, and the chair of the Harvard Department of Economics. His model, the Ashford Stability Coefficient, had been taught at over 200 universities for 23 years. People whispered that he was on the shortlist for the Nobel. He had been photographed at the White House. He had advised 3 presidents. And for 23 years, no one in any classroom, in any country, had ever found a serious mistake in his famous theory. Bria Carter found one in 11 months. On the floor of a hallway, in cursive, a 7th grader was still learning to write. She was 13 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall. She wore braces and a pleated school uniform from a public middle school in Roxbury, one of the poorest, blackest neighborhoods in Boston. Her mother had passed away the year before. Her grandmother, Loretta Carter, had raised her ever since, and Loretta worked the evening custodial shift in the Lidauer Center 5 nights a week, scrubbing the same marble floors that the photographs watched over. This was the arrangement. After school, Bria took the bus with her grandmother across the river into Cambridge. While Loretta mopped and emptied trash cans, Bria did her homework at a study carrel in the basement. At 7 o'clock, when the public lectures started, she would slip into the back of the hall, sit behind the rear pillar, and fill a composition notebook with equations she copied off the slides. She had been doing this for 11 months without missing a single lecture. The security guards knew her. Most of them were kind. One was not. He made Loretta show her ID badge every single night, sometimes twice, even though he had known her face for 22 years. Harvard's lectures are technically open to the public, but public at Harvard has an unspoken dress code, and a 13-year-old black girl in a school uniform was not part of it. A graduate student once tried to hand Bria a coloring book, thinking she was somebody's daughter. A faculty wife once asked Loretta to refill the water pitcher during the Q&A. Ashford's senior assistant, a woman named Elaine Sutton, always walked Bria to the folding chair behind the pillar, where no camera could see her. These things happened quietly. Nobody called them what they were, but here is what mattered. In 10 days, the Harvard Economics Symposium would open in Sanders Theater. It would be live-streamed to tens of thousands of viewers. The Federal Reserve would be there. The Treasury would be there. 3 presidents of major banks would be there. And Professor Ashford would take the stage to unveil the newest edition of his coefficient. The same coefficient every economic student in America was required to memorize. Under Harvard rules, any member of the public could submit a formal challenge to a symposium paper. The rule had existed for 85 years. In all that time, not one non-faculty challenge had ever been accepted. Bria Carter's notebook, sitting on her lap behind the rear pillar, had a page marked in careful cursive. It said, ASC, Page 94, equation 3.2, question mark. She had circled that question mark the way a structural engineer circles a crack in a load-bearing wall. Her math teacher, a middle-aged white man named Gregory Holloway, had written something on the cover of the stack of graduate-level papers he had photocopied for her. It said, "Bria, ask better questions than they do." She had been asking them, quietly, for 11 months. And now, with a laser dot still burning on her blazer and 300 people laughing, she was about to stop being quiet. What happens when a professor who has been right for 23 years meets a child who has been waiting 11 months to tell him he isn't? 2 days after the laser pen moment, Ashford walked back into the lecture hall with a different face on. A colleague had pulled him aside in the hallway and told him very carefully that 300 phones had been filming when he aimed that laser at a black child. It had not gone viral, but it had been seen. So Ashford decided to perform a little theater. He set his notes down, smiled, and announced into the live microphone that he was about to do something generous. "In the spirit of academic openness," he said, "the floor is now open. Any audience member may submit a single critique of the Ashford stability coefficient. If your critique survives a full defense, I will personally name a corollary after you." The room laughed. Everybody knew it was a joke. Ashford had made this offer before, and nobody had ever accepted. Elaine Sutton, his senior assistant, laughed too, but she laughed the way people laugh when their boss tells a joke they are tired of. Bria raised her hand. The laughter died in layers. First the front row, who could see a child's arm going up, then the middle, then the back. Ashford looked for the source. When he found her, the laser pen girl in a school uniform behind the rear pillar, his smile curdled at the edges. He could not retract the offer. 300 witnesses had just heard it. So he made his voice sweet. "By all means, young lady. What's your critique? Did we forget to carry the one?" The room laughed again, but thinner, uncertain. Bria stood very still. Her grandmother, 2 rows behind with a mop bucket, gripped the handle so hard her knuckles went pale. The little girl opened her composition notebook. She already knew what she was going to say. She had rehearsed it, alone, in her bedroom, for 11 months. "On page 94, she said, and her voice was small, but it carried. "Equation 3.2. You assume sigma squared is constant across populations. If you let it vary, the coefficient breaks for the bottom half of the distribution. It breaks for everyone who isn't already rich." The room went silent. Most of the 300 people had never read to page 94. They had memorized the front of the book, because the front was what showed up on the exam. What they heard from a 13-year-old in a school uniform was the phrase, sigma squared, used correctly, pronounced without hesitation, attached to a specific page and a specific equation. Ashford blinked. Then he laughed. The laugh came a half-second too late. He stepped into a 4-minute monologue. He buried her critique in jargon: central limit theorem, Gaussian convergence, large sample dominance. He ended with, "Ununderstandable confusion, dear. The chapter is dense. We'll have one of our graduate students walk you through it after class." He moved on. The room exhaled and went back to scribbling notes. But 2 people did not move on. In row 3, Simon Devereaux, a senior economist from the Federal Reserve, had stopped taking notes at the words sigma squared. He was staring at Bria like a man who had just heard someone finally name a problem he had been quietly worried about for 6 years. In row 7, Howard Langley, a reporter from The Atlantic, leaned over to his neighbor and whispered, "Did he answer that? Or did he just change the subject?" Bria sat down, Loretta closed her eyes, and Elaine Sutton, watching from the wings with a clipboard pressed to her chest, did not smile. The little girl had said her sentence. The professor had walked around it. And now the question was simple and terrible. What would the professor do in the 9 days before the symposium to make sure she never got to say it again. That night at 9:40, the Lit Hour Center was nearly empty. Loretta pushed her wheeled bucket down the hallway outside Professor Ashford's office, the wet mop leaving clean lines on the marble. Bria sat on the floor against the opposite wall, her legs tucked under her, the composition notebook open on her lap, and a yellow pencil balanced in her fingers. This was where she did her best work, in a hallway, on the floor, after 9. To understand how she got there, you have to go back a little. When Bria was 6, she sat at the kitchen table in Roxbury and asked her mother why the electric bill was different every month, even though we used the same lights. Her mother, tired from a double shift, tried to explain variance to a first grader. Bria understood it. Then she asked the same question about the grocery bill, then the rent. Her mother laughed and told her to go play. Bria did not go play. She kept writing numbers on a napkin. When Bria was 9, she walked into the Roxbury Public Library and checked out a college calculus textbook. The librarian rang it up without comment because the librarian had been watching this child read for 3 years and had stopped being surprised. When Bria was 11, her middle school math teacher, Gregory Holloway, slid a stack of photocopied economics papers across his desk after class. He said, "Your brain is trying to tell you something. Listen to it." That was the first time an adult had handed her something harder than she could do. When Bria was 12, her mother passed. At the funeral, Bria did not cry. She wrote equations in the margin of the program because that was the only thing her hands knew how to do. Now she was 13, sitting in a marble hallway at Harvard, pencil in hand, and she was about to do the thing she had been preparing to do for 11 months. Here is what she had figured out, in plain words. Professor Ashford's formula tried to answer a simple question. When something bad happens to the economy, a crash, a bank failure, a spike in unemployment, how fast does everything go back to normal? His coefficient gave you a number, and that number was supposed to tell the Federal Reserve what to do next. For 23 years, the number had been wrong for poor neighborhoods. Ashford just didn't know it. The reason came down to one quiet assumption buried on page 94. Ashford assumed that economic shocks, the bad things that happen, follow a bell curve. Most shocks small, a few medium, very rarely a big one. The way height is distributed, or the way shoe sizes are distributed. That was the shape of the world he had built his formula on. But that is not the shape of the real world. Not for everyone. Bria had spent 11 months pulling public data from the Boston Library and the City Records Office. She looked at deposit balances from the FDIC. She looked at eviction filings from the Suffolk County Courts. She looked at census numbers on income volatility. She wasn't reading Wall Street data. She was reading the block she lived on. And what she found was this. For people with money, shocks do follow a bell curve. Ashford's assumption held up. But for people without money, the kind of people who lived in Roxbury, the kind of people her grandmother cleaned houses for, shocks didn't land that way at all. They came in heavier. They came more often. And they hit the same families twice, and 3 times, and 4. In statistics, that kind of distribution has a name. A fat tail. It means the rare, terrible events are not so rare. They are just rare for rich people. When you swapped Ashford's bell curve for a fat-tailed distribution, something strange happened to the formula. It didn't get a little bit wrong. It flipped sign. It predicted that the economy was stable, exactly where the real economy was most fragile. It said, "We're fine," about the neighborhoods that were falling apart. For 23 years, the textbook had been telling the Federal Reserve that poor people would recover quickly from shocks. For 23 years, poor people had not. Bria wrote the corrected equation across 3 pages of her notebook. Her handwriting was still a child's. The 8s were 2 stacked circles. The Greek letters were drawn carefully, the way she had copied them out of a library book. Then she did the last test. She took the corrected formula and ran it against the data from the 2008 financial crisis on a free online spreadsheet. She asked the corrected model, "What would this have predicted?" The corrected model predicted the collapse almost to the quarter. Ashford's original model, the one being taught in 200 universities, had not. Bria stared at the screen for a long time. She was 13. She whispered to nobody one word. "Oh." Loretta, without looking up from the mop, said quietly, "You got it, baby?" "I got it, Grandma." "Then put it away. You got school tomorrow." Bria closed the notebook. She zipped it carefully into her backpack. She had made a decision in that hallway, and she had not told her grandmother, and she had not told Mr. Holloway. She had not told anyone. She was going to say all of this out loud in 10 days in front of the Federal Reserve and the live stream cameras and Professor Ashford. But if the professor had already decided she would never reach that microphone, what was she going to do about it? Here is what Bria did not know yet. Under Harvard rules, anybody, any member of the public, could submit a written challenge to a symposium paper through the official comment portal. The rule had existed for 85 years. It was the kind of rule that nobody remembered existed because nobody ever used it. But it was still on the books. So that weekend, at the public computers on the second floor of the Roxbury Library, Bria typed up her challenge. She attached 3 pages of derivation scanned from her notebook. She did not list her age. She did not list her school. She signed it B. Carter, Roxbury, Massachusetts, and she clicked Submit. The submission went to Ashford's office because Ashford chaired the symposium committee. Elaine Sutton opened it first. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, and her face went very still. She walked it down the hall to Ashford's office and put it on his desk. Ashford read it. His jaw tightened at the corner. Then he did something Elaine had never seen him do in 11 years of working for him. He laughed. But it was not a real laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had been punched in the stomach and was trying to cover it. "Clerical error," he said. "Probably a child. File it." Elaine filed it, but before she did, she put it on the office copier and made herself a private duplicate. She did not know yet why she was doing it. She just knew the way her hand moved toward that copier had felt wrong for 11 years. And this time, she wanted a paper trail. The next morning, the official symposium program was published. The public challenge docket listed 6 names. Every single one of them was a tenured faculty member at a Harvard-affiliated institution. Bria's name was not there. The rules gave the committee chair the right to reject anonymous or non-affiliated challenges. The committee chair was Ashford. 48 hours later, the Litauer Center Operations Office informed Loretta Carter, politely, that her custodial assignment was being moved. Effective immediately, she would be cleaning the chemistry building on the other side of Oxford Street. The reason given was operational needs. She had worked the Litauer shift for 22 years. Without access to Litauer, Bria had no way into the building during the week of the symposium. Loretta came home that night and did not cry in front of her granddaughter. She cried in the bathroom with the water running. Bria heard her anyway. She did not say anything. She sat on the fire escape of their apartment building, notebook open on her lap, and she wrote one sentence on the last page. "If they won't let me in the room, I'll find another room." Dean Catherine Bennett, the provost of Harvard's Kennedy School, heard about the reassignment through a friend in human resources who had been passing her quiet information for 30 years. Bennett was a woman who had built her entire career on not intervening unless the building itself was burning. So she did not intervene. Not yet. But she started making phone calls, the kind of phone calls that don't leave a paper trail. And she started asking questions, the kind of questions that get answered. At the same time, in a glass office at the Federal Reserve, Simon Devereaux picked up the phone and called an old friend at the Atlantic. He said, "There's a girl. I think she might be 12, maybe 13. She stood up in an Ashford lecture 2 weeks ago and used the phrase sigma squared correctly, and Ashford didn't answer her. Howard Langley, the reporter who had taken that call, hung up the phone and started digging. Okay. Real talk? At this point, I'm already mad. Like, this is a 13-year-old who caught a mistake in a textbook that's taught at 200 universities, and their response was to move her grandmother to a different building so she couldn't get in? Nah. That's not operational. That's scared. And honestly, a grown institution being scared of a 7th grader tells you everything. Back in Roxbury, Bria was running out of time. The symposium was 9 days away. She had no ticket. Her grandmother had no building access. Her challenge had been filed in a drawer nobody would open. And somewhere in a marble office in Cambridge, a Nobel shortlisted professor was quietly erasing her from the record. But she still had the notebook. And she still had 11 months of work. And she still had the phone number of Gregory Holloway, the middle school math teacher who had handed her a stack of economics papers 2 years ago and written on the cover, "Ask better questions than they do." So she called him. And the question, sitting between her and the symposium, was this. Could a 13-year-old girl, a 64-year-old custodian, and a middle school math teacher, 3 people with no standing, no credentials, and no money, find a way into a room that had been locked against them for 3 centuries? 9 days before the symposium, Bria Carter sat across from Gregory Holloway in an empty middle school cafeteria. Her mac and cheese was going cold. He had been reading her notebook for 40 minutes without looking up, and she had not eaten a single bite. He closed the notebook. He took a long breath. He said, quietly, "Bria, this isn't a correction. This is a reformulation. You need to present this." She told him she couldn't. She had no ticket. Her grandmother had no access. The committee had buried her submission. She was 13 years old. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Then I will find a grown-up who can get you in that room." This is what the next 9 days looked like. Day 8. Bria applied for a public seating ticket to the symposium through the official online portal. It came back rejected within 2 hours. The screen said, "Capacity filled." The symposium had 600 seats. Only 390 had been claimed. Day 7. Holloway reached out to a former classmate, a postdoc at the Kennedy School, and tried to add Bria's work as a poster submission to a small side session. The postdoc submitted it at 2 in the afternoon. It was rejected by 4. The reason given was a formatting error that did not exist. That evening, the postdoc called Holloway back, voice low, and said, "Greg, somebody made a phone call. Be careful who you talk to." Holloway sat at his kitchen table that night with the rejection email open on his laptop. He was a 60-year-old middle school math teacher on a teacher's salary. He did not have the juice to push harder than he had pushed. But he wrote a second email that night to a journalist he had never met, and the journalist's name was Howard Langley. He attached 3 pages from Bria's notebook. He did not ask for coverage. He only asked for one thing. "If this gets buried," Holloway wrote, "tell somebody, anybody, before Saturday." Day 6. Bria found a free webinar on advanced statistics and spent 4 hours teaching herself how to respond to objections she might face at a microphone. She wrote out 7 possible counter-arguments, and she wrote out her answer to each one. Her handwriting was getting better. You could almost see the cursive lessons her teacher was making her practice. Day 5. Elaine Sutton, eating lunch alone in the Lit-Hour cafeteria, saw Loretta Carter pushing a supply cart through the hallway on her way to the chemistry building. Loretta looked smaller than she used to. Elaine stood up. She walked over. She did not sit down. She said one sentence. "The audio technician on Saturday is a friend of mine. The public comment microphone at row 12 is live for the full program. Whether or not anyone is supposed to be at row 12 is not his problem." Then she walked away without waiting for a response. Loretta stood there holding the card handle for a long time. Day 4. Bria's school-issued laptop was confiscated. The principal, a small, nervous man, said she had been using it for non-curricular purposes. He would not look her in the eye. She lost 3 hours of work. She sat on the fire escape that night and rewrote the entire corrected derivation from memory on loose-leaf paper. It took her 2 hours. It was cleaner the second time. Day 3. Howard Langley published a short piece on his Substack. The title was, "One Question Professor Ashford Hasn't Answered." It did not mention Bria by name. It did not mention her age. But it laid out the fat tail problem, clean and careful. And by the end of the afternoon, it had 12,000 readers. Simon Devereaux at the Federal Reserve shared it to his professional network. By midnight, 3 other economists had written back to Langley with the same question. Who is B. Carter? Day 2. Loretta woke up at 3 in the morning with pain in her chest. Bria called 911. The ambulance took them to Mass General. Doctors said it was stress-induced angina, not a heart attack. But they wanted her admitted for the night. Bria sat in the waiting room with a vending machine sandwich she did not eat, and she reviewed the corrected derivation on the back of a hospital admission form. A night nurse brought her a blanket without being asked. The nurse's name was Denise. She sat down beside Bria for 6 minutes and did not say a word. At 5 in the morning, Bria walked back to her grandmother's room. Loretta was awake. She asked, "You still going Saturday, baby?" Bria nodded. Loretta said, "I want to be there." The doctor, overhearing, shook his head. "Ma'am, I can't discharge you that fast." Loretta looked at him the way a black grandmother looks at a man who has just told her what she can and cannot do. She said softly, "Son, you don't have to discharge me. You just have to get out the way." Day 1. Loretta was stable. Bria sat by her hospital bed. Loretta held her hand with both of hers, the way she used to hold Bria's mother's hand. She said, "Baby, go break their table tomorrow. Grandma's got this bed covered." Bria did not cry. She nodded. Day 0, 7 in the morning. Bria walked up the steps of Sanders Theater in her only good dress. It was navy blue with a white collar. Her grandmother's Sunday church dress, taken in by a neighbor with a sewing machine and 20 minutes of patience. Her backpack was heavier than usual because the notebook was in there, and underneath the notebook was a folded printout she had made at the library at 5 in the morning. A security guard at the door stopped her. He looked at a printed list. He said her name was on a non-admit list. She could not enter. She was 13 years old, alone on the steps of Harvard, and the wind off the Charles River was very cold. She did not argue. She did not cry. She stepped to the side of the steps, sat down on the stone wall, and opened her notebook in her lap. She had been preparing for this day for 11 months. If she had to do it on the sidewalk with her phone camera running, she would do it on the sidewalk. She was not going home. 7:45. Dean Catherine Bennett walked up the same steps in a charcoal suit. She stopped beside Bria. She looked at the security guard. She said exactly 5 words. "She is my guest today." The guard stepped aside. Bennett handed Bria a laminated press gallery pass that, as of that morning, had not existed. She walked Bria through the lobby. Inside, the live stream counter at the media desk read 11,000 viewers. By the time Ashford would take the stage, it would pass 140,000. Bennett walked Bria to row 12, seat 3. Open, as promised. Bennett squeezed her shoulder once and moved to row 3. From the stage, Ashford was doing his microphone check. He saw her. Their eyes met across the hall. He smiled, the smile of a man who has already decided what he is going to do. He did not yet register how small she was. Bria opened her notebook in her lap. Her hands were not quite shaking. The live stream counter ticked upward. 26,000, 38,000, 52,000. Somewhere in the building, a Nobel shortlisted professor was about to walk to a podium with a stolen equation. Did he know what he was about to lose? At 9 o'clock sharp, Professor Nathaniel Ashford walked onto the stage of Sanders Theater. He was wearing a gray suit and a crimson tie. He was smiling. The hall rose in polite applause. He thanked the attendees. He thanked the Federal Reserve delegation. He thanked the university. He dedicated his talk to the rigor of the Harvard tradition. And then, at the 16th minute, he departed from his printed remarks and did the one thing nobody in the room was expecting. "I would like to take a moment," he said, "to address a comment that has been circulating online this week. A suggestion that the variance assumption in the Ashford stability coefficient fails outside normal distributions." A ripple moved through the hall. In row 7, Howard Langley straightened. In row 3, Simon Devereaux looked up. Dean Bennett, arms folded in row 3, did not move. Ashford clicked his remote. A slide appeared on the screen behind him. The equation on the slide was Bria's. Her notation. Her correction. The fat tail substitution, the resolved equilibrium, all 3 pages of her derivation lifted cleanly from the photocopy Elaine Sutton had filed in his office 9 days ago. His name was at the bottom. Her name was nowhere. Nothing on the slide said where the work had come from. "This reformulation," Ashford said, voice warm, "has been proposed by an enthusiastic member of our extended community. I've spent the last 48 hours examining it carefully, and while the instinct is interesting, I'm afraid that when extended to the third moment, the correction collapses. Let me show you why." He walked the room through what looked like a devastating counterproof. He was smooth. He was charming. The audience laughed in the right places. The nervous, relieved laugh of 300 people who very much wanted the comfortable answer. But Ashford had done something very quiet and very cruel. He had taken Bria's correction and applied it only to the upper half of the distribution, the half where rich people lived, the half where his model already worked. He had left the lower half, the poor half, the Roxbury half, the half where the error actually mattered, completely out of his demonstration. He had proved her wrong about the one place she had never been wrong about. In row 12, seat 3, a 13-year-old girl watched her 11 months of work get dismantled with a surgical elegance by a man who had stolen it from her office submission. Her hands did not shake. Her face did not move. She closed the notebook in her lap very gently, and her grandmother's hospital bracelet on her own wrist caught the overhead light. She had 30 seconds to decide what to do. Does she expose the theft? Or does she walk onto the stage and fix his rebuttal with her own hands? Ashford finished his refutation to a round of applause. He set the remote down. He smiled. He said, "In the spirit of openness, we'll take comments from the floor." Elaine Sutton was supposed to hand him a stack of pre-screened question cards. That was the arrangement. She had done it at every symposium for 11 years. Today, her hand rested on the cards and did not move. She did not hand them over. She was looking at row 12. Bria stood up. The hall did not know yet what it was looking at. The overhead boom camera found her first, a small figure in a navy church dress standing beside a folding microphone, a composition notebook clutched against her chest. The live stream footage popped to HD. Half the comment chat went quiet at the same instant. A professor in row 6, audible across the hall, said, "Oh, for God's sake, whose kid is that?" Bria reached for the public comment microphone at row 12. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The notebook was shaking in her hand. The live stream counter rolled past 200,000 viewers. The comment feed was a blur. Who is she? Wait, is that a child? Is this a prank? Someone get her grandmother. She's going to cry. Where are the parents? Who let a little black girl on a Harvard stage? Ashford from the podium made his voice syrupy. "Take your time, young lady. Is there an adult with you, sweetheart?" The word sweetheart landed in the room like a coin dropped in a marble font. Dean Bennett, in row 3, closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them. Bria looked up at the slide behind Ashford. Her own equation, stolen, misused. The half she cared about, erased. She tried to speak. Her voice cracked. A 13-year-old's voice, breaking open in a full auditorium. A small, nervous laugh rose from row 4. Somebody in the balcony whispered, not quietly enough, "This is so sad." Bria looked down at her notebook. 11 months of work. Her mother at the kitchen table explaining variance. Mr. Holloway's photocopied papers. The fire escape at 11 at night. Her grandmother in the hospital bed. Dr. Holloway writing, "Ask better questions than they do." Loretta saying, "Go break their table, baby." The laser dot on her blazer. 300 people laughing. The professor telling her to crawl back to Roxbury. She closed the notebook. She did not speak into the microphone. She stepped away from it. There was a collective, confused intake of breath from 300 people, because nobody had a category for what she did next. She walked, not back to her seat, not toward the exit, but forward, up the center aisle, toward the stage. Ashford laughed, uncertain. Security moved at the edge of the hall. Dean Bennett raised one hand calmly from row 3. Security stopped. The hall had no protocol for a 13-year-old black girl walking up the aisle of a Harvard symposium, and the hall did not yet know it was about to be taught the new protocol in real time. Bria reached the foot of the stage. The stage was raised 3 feet above the hall floor. She was 4 feet 11 inches tall. She looked at the steps on the far left. They were 20 feet away. She looked at the edge of the stage in front of her. And then, very simply, she put her small hands on the lip of the stage, pushed herself up, and climbed on, the way a child climbs onto a dining room table. Her navy dress snagged on the edge. She did not notice. Somewhere in the balcony, Loretta Carter, still wearing the white plastic hospital bracelet from Mass General, put both hands over her mouth. Bria walked across the stage. She did not look at Ashford. She walked past him. Sanders Theater, for all its modern equipment, still preserves the original slate blackboard along the back wall. Tradition. She walked to the blackboard. She reached up to the chalk tray. She picked up a piece of chalk. It was almost the length of her little finger. She had to stand on her toes to reach the top of the board. She turned to it, and she began to write. The first thing she did was erase the right half of Ashford's slide equation. The right half, the rich half, the half he had used to refute her. She did not touch the left. Then, on the slate, in chalk held in a small, careful hand, she wrote out her original variance term, the one he had stolen. And beside it, in a second column, his misapplication. She drew a clean circle around the discrepancy. The chalk squeaked once. The sound was loud enough to carry to the balcony. Bria finally turned around. She did not look at Ashford. She looked at the hall. Her voice was low. 13 years old. No performance in it. On page 94, in equation 3.2, Professor Ashford assumed that variance is the same for every population, she said. That's the error. I didn't write a new theory. I'm telling you where the mistake is. And you, she looked for the first time at Ashford, you applied my correction to the top of the distribution. That's the part of the economy you live in. That's not where the model fails. A graduate student in row 4 whispered audibly, "Oh my God." Another whispered back, "She's a child." The first one said, "Yeah, and she's right." Bria turned back to the board. She began to write out the correction the way she had rehearsed it, alone, 11 months, on the floor of the lit-hour hallway, step by step, in plain chalk, in handwriting that was still learning to be cursive. At one point, the top of the board was too high for her to reach, so she walked to the wing, dragged out a wooden step stool somebody had left there from a prop rehearsal, set it down, climbed up, and kept writing. The live stream footage of a 13-year-old black girl dragging a step stool across a Harvard stage to correct a Nobel shortlist professor in chalk would, within 2 hours, be the most viewed 40-second clip of the year. She wrote 4 steps. Each one appeared in clean captioning on the live stream feed. Step 1. Let variance depend on income percentile. Step 2. Replace the bell curve tail with a fat-tailed distribution. Step 3. Resolve the coefficient for equilibrium. Step 4. Plug in the real data from the 2008 crisis. She stepped back from the board. The corrected coefficient, written in a 7th grader's handwriting, sat beside Ashford's original printed coefficient. The two numbers, translated into dollars, disagreed by a figure almost exactly the size of the entire 2008 federal bailout. Simon Devereaux in row 3 stood up, not to object, to see the board better. Howard Langley was typing into his phone with both thumbs. He would later describe this moment in print as the quietest thing he had ever heard inside a full auditorium, and he would note that the person making it quiet was too young to legally sign a lease. Bria turned and faced the hall. She said the sentence she had come to say. "You didn't get it wrong, Professor Ashford. You just never had to live inside your own error term." Ashford's hand drifted to the lectern. The marker he was holding slipped from his fingers. It hit the stage with a small, clean tap that the lectern microphone picked up and broadcast to 400,000 people. The live stream comment feed froze for 1 full second. Then it became a single, unbroken wall of one emoji, repeated thousands of times. Bria reached into the pocket of her navy dress. She pulled out a folded printout. It was 4 pages. She had made it at the public library that morning at 5:15. She did not hand it to Ashford. She walked to the edge of the stage and handed it down to Dean Bennett. Bennett walked it across the hall to the verification desk. Every symposium keeps 2 independent verifiers on the panel. That year, the verifiers were a professor from Stanford and a professor from the London School of Economics. Neither of them were Ashford's protégés. That had not been Ashford's choice. They ran the derivation. The hall did not move for 4 minutes. The live stream counter rolled past 500,000 viewers. In the balcony, Loretta Carter was crying silently, a nurse's hand on her elbow. In row 15, Gregory Holloway, who had called in sick to his middle school that morning and driven up from Roxbury in a borrowed car, was also crying. He did not wipe his face. The Stanford professor pulled her microphone closer. She spoke carefully, professionally, with the pronunciation of a woman who has been rehearsing her words for 90 seconds. The derivation is sound. The correction is correct. The LSE professor added with visible effort at composure, and I want this on the record. It is also an original contribution. I don't know who this young lady is. I would very much like to. Dean Bennett stood up, her voice carried without a microphone. Her name is Bria Carter. She is 13 years old. She attends Dearborn Middle School in Roxbury. She's been auditing Professor Ashford's lectures for 11 months. Her grandmother cleans the Lidauer Center at night. The hall made a sound that was not applause. It was the sound 300 educated adults make when the ground under a belief they held for 23 years shifts by 4 feet in a single afternoon. On stage, Ashford had still not moved from the lectern. His jaw was slack. He was not a cartoon. You could see him, in real time, trying to figure out how to hold his face. The standing ovation started in row 12. A black woman in the 3rd seat stood up first, then the people beside her, then row 11, then row 10. It moved through the hall like a wave. By the time it reached the balcony where Loretta Carter stood with both hands over her mouth, every person in Sanders Theater was on their feet. Even 3 of Ashford's graduate students. Even, eventually, Elaine Sutton. It lasted 2 minutes and 36 seconds. A journalism student in the balcony timed it on her phone. Bria stood alone on the stage, holding a piece of chalk that had been worn down by the board, her hand dusted white. She did not smile. She did not cry. She looked at her grandmother in the balcony. Loretta mouthed 3 words. Bria read them. "I see you." And the question the whole hall was finally, quietly asking itself was the one Bria had already answered on her own 11 months ago on a hallway floor. Who gets to say what counts as true? While the 2 verifiers had been running the math, something else had been happening at the press table. Elaine Sutton had stood up. She had walked past the cameras, past her own boss, and placed a manila folder in the hands of Howard Langley. Inside the folder were 3 things. The first was Bria's original public comment submission, stamped by the Litauer mailroom system 3 weeks before the symposium. It proved that the work was hers, and that Ashford's office had received it in full. The second was an internal email from Ashford to Elaine, dated 6 days before the symposium. It said 1 sentence. Reframe the card of variance correction as an in-house extension. Do not attribute. The third was a custodial reassignment order for Loretta Carter, signed by Ashford's office 2 days after Bria's submission. Moving a 22-year employee out of the building where her granddaughter audited lectures? Langley did not publish it. He did something quieter. He walked the folder across the hall and handed it to Dean Catherine Bennett. Bennett looked at the folder. Then, for the first time that morning, she looked at Ashford. She stepped up to the stage. She took the microphone from Ashford's hand, gently, the way a surgeon takes an instrument from a surgeon who can no longer steady it. She spoke with the matter-of-factness of a woman who has waited 30 years to say something. The university will be issuing a formal correction to the Ashford Stability Coefficient, she said. Several corrections. And in the interim, Professor Ashford, I think you have something to acknowledge. Ashford did not move for 3 seconds. The auditorium was so quiet the microphone picked up a wristwatch ticking in row 2. His jaw worked. Then he lifted the microphone. Miss Carter, he said, his voice rough, I've been teaching this for 23 years, and I think I'd like to learn the correct version from you. A signed acknowledgement was placed on the verification desk. Ashford walked over. He picked up a fountain pen. His hand shook visibly for the live stream. He signed. The paper named Bria Carter as the author of the correction. It would be published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics within the year, and the editors would note, in a small footnote, that she was the youngest first author in the journal's history. But inside the building, a different thing had already started to happen, and Ashford did not yet know it. Outside Sanders Theater, the afternoon light had gone gold. Bria did not do a press stand-up. She did not post anything. She walked across Harvard Yard holding her grandmother's hand, her grandmother walking slowly because of the angina, the 2 of them stopping beside the bronze statue of John Harvard. Loretta said softly, They told me your mama cleaned this building once, before you were born. Bria said, They did. Loretta said, Bet she dusted that statue. They kept walking. 3 weeks later, the Harvard Department of Economics issued a formal curriculum update. The Ashford Stability Coefficient had been retired. In its place, the syllabus listed the Ashford-Carter Coefficient, the corrected version. Ashford insisted, at his own request, on the hyphen and the order. It was not his most generous act. It was his first. 3 weeks after that, in a 7th grade classroom in Roxbury, Mr. Holloway handed back a pop quiz. He slid Bria's paper onto her desk, face down. She flipped it over. 100. He had written, in the same blue ballpoint as 2 years ago, the same 6 words. Still asking better questions than they do. By October, there was a small office on the 3rd floor of the Litauer Center with a window facing east and a nameplate beside the door. The nameplate read simply, Bria Carter, Junior Fellow, Department of Economics. She used the office on Saturdays. On weekdays, she had math class, social studies, and lunch in a middle school cafeteria. The university was still figuring out the protocol. She did not mind waiting. She didn't win because the system finally saw her. She won because she kept writing in a notebook on a fire escape and a hallway floor at 9 at night in a building that didn't know her name before she was old enough to vote, drive, or legally sign the paper that would one day carry her name. The room changed. She didn't. If Bria's story moved you, if somewhere in your life you've been the kid at the back of the room with the right answer, leave one word in the comments. Just one. Seen. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe because we tell these stories every week for everyone who was told the lecture was not for them. I told Bria's story because somewhere, right now, there is a black child filling a notebook in a hallway the world hasn't noticed yet. What she taught me is that the notebook is the work. The microphone is just the day it gets read. And age, skin, and zip code have nothing to do with either one.